But when Rome was threatened enough, right, it was possible, legally possible, and theoretically possible, and non-controversial, right, to elect a speaker who could not make constitutional changes, but who had something like absolute authority in these times of crisis. Now, there's a big difference between this model and the model of, say, Hitler or George W. Bush or the Patriot Act, which is that decision of ancient Rome was a properly Republican one. As good as ancient societies get, right? We're talking about landholders, often very small landholders, but landholders nonetheless. And obviously women and slaves were not included. But within the Republic proper, right, that was which is a big caveat, which, and I don't ever want to denigrate that, but I think we have reached a level where that isn't necessarily the single most important issue. But within that republic, there was nothing controversial about electing someone with the authority to protect the republic. And despite, I'm sorry, I have to make this next step though, right? And so this is why I'm very hesitant of the slings and arrows cast at, in a simple way, cast at the Soviet, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the People's Republic of China, right? So just a small historical dig there, sorry.
Well,
I was curious how much anarcho-primitivists would advocate that ideology just due to the idea of the combination of technology and capitalism just putting us on a path where we live in really unsustainable ways, so that in contrast to Native American communities, for example, where they lived in a way where they didn't destroy the environment, they lived in sustainable ways that could persist indefinitely, as opposed to, say, in a civilization, even not necessarily capitalist, but even, say, the way the Soviet Union ran things, because they obviously were good with technology and did a lot of environmental damage and things like that. But the importance of the idea of just saying, because of technology and development, industrialization, et cetera, we're living in a way that just can't be sustained because we're destroying the environment, and maybe that's the reason that this current civilization, which is expanded across the entire globe, will fall just due to the environmental damage we're doing. Like, how much does that play into their thinking, as opposed to just the idea of, like, say, a typical anarchist who would be opposed to exploitation and one person ruling over another?
Oh, it plays a great role. I mean, most anarcho-primitivists basically hold the idea that civilization is going to fall no matter what, as it has throughout the history of civilizations. And specifically due to the fact that civilizations, by their very nature, overexploit their environment.
Because I can see a big difference in, say, the fall of Babylon or the fall of Rome, and, say, the fall of, if our civilization were to fall, just because there's massive differences in what we're doing to the environment.
But I mean, still, the environmental thing is there with even those ancient civilizations, because they, with their agriculture, they caused desertification in the places where they lived. So they had to go out, and they had to go out and conquer other societies whose topsoil and things like that were not depleted, so they could get their resources. Eventually, they stretched themselves too thin and couldn't support that, and so they collapsed. So it is, I mean, there are other factors that come into that, like where, slaves revolting, or people in the colonies revolting and things like that. But at its fundamental core, it's an environmental problem.
Yeah, so I had a question. You made a comment about, so this Native American tribe, it's TV, and there's this centralized source where, these values and such come from, and it's spreading out to a mass of people, and this is like something that's critiqued by anarcho-primitivists. Mm-hmm. Is the converse relationship a source of, like, would they critique that as well, namely like a collective will of the community coming up against a particular individual in some way and sort of trying to influence them in the same way that a centralized value would influence a whole community? Or is that something that an anarcho-primitivist would encourage, right? The community
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, Native Americans and things like that gathered together in councils and things like that you know, to make collective decisions and things like that. But I think the point is that with anarcho-primitivism, the important part is the scale of the society in which those discussions happen, right? Like the people who are involved in these communal decisions all know each other, all know their interests, and are all, you know, have interests in those other people's interests, right? And so they would say that that local control would be far superior to remote control.
So collective will is justifiable is acceptable so long as that will reflects a community of people who like know each other personally, right? And can
sure.
Give each other in that way.
And that's more of my opinion. I'm sure there are some anarcho-primitivists who would probably have problems with collective will as well. But, yeah. Kenny?
Oh, yeah. Just I guess there's a few things, like a small comment on the reliability of, I would question the reliability of Columbus's testimony just because not because it's necessarily wrong, but there's a reason why he would be writing whatever he's writing. He was writing, it seems to me, if I can just comment straight up, a pretty romanticized view of the reality of a primitive life. This idea that it's, I'm suspicious whether or not it's as that egalitarian. But the biggest problem is intertribal conflicts, which is the beginning, the grounds of class conflict, once racial domination. It starts out, in other words, there's a myth about, you know, feudal society. There were protectors, and then there were workers. But in fact, the protectors were the ones that came and killed off, you know, the strongest of a tribe, and made the rest of the tribe the workers. Then they said, we're your protectors now, right? And they were never. It was basically racial domination turned into class, and racial domination is possible because people are identifying overly locally. And since it sounds to me that like anarcho-primitivism is more of a prediction about how things are going to be than like an actual like there aren't like a bunch of concrete steps that are super realistic about how globally to implement it. I would say that that's something that any anarcho-primitivist should take a hard look at.
Yeah, I agree. There's no steps.
We're going to go back to just a really, really racist world.
I don't know about that, but I mean, possibly in the like
provincial racist, like we're this, you're that, and conflicts arise.
Native American tribes in general were much more accepting of other races than were the white societies at the time. Black runaway slaves.
I don't mean by race. By race, I do not mean blacks, whites, and Asians.
You're talking about tribal differentiation.
I mean, race for me is tribe. Okay. My tribe versus your tribe.
But what I'm saying is that there are many examples of white people running away from civilization, of black people running away from slavery, and joining up with the Native Americans, right? I don't think it was. I mean, sure, like.
But between Native American groups, there were conflicts.
Absolutely, there were conflicts.
And those kind of things would resurface, end out escalating, and you would have what you have. I mean, the process would happen all over. It wouldn't stay stagnant and harmonious. Or at least I would like to think about how to have something that doesn't just start the whole process over.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And it maintains a certain harmony between the local groups.
Okay. Yeah, I think that first off, tribal warfare differs greatly from modern industrialized warfare, or even just civilized warfare. In that civilized,
it becomes eventually. I would say it becomes eventually modern civilized warfare. It starts out tribal. And
I don't think that they are. I don't think that they are similar in that way. I think I think tribal warfare is about maintaining boundaries, right? It's a form of making sure people's populations don't get out of hand. So occasionally they would initiate raids against other parties. It wasn't a large systematic fight to eliminate another tribe. It was a maintaining of boundaries. In this sense, it actually helped maintain the harmony that I'm talking about.